The crack echoed through the southern New Mexico State Fair arena like a gunshot, silencing 10,000 voices in an instant. Jacob Miles lay motionless in the dirt, a dark pool of blood spreading beneath his head like spilled paint on canvas. Above him, Midnight Thunder's massive hoof dripped crimson as the bull snorted and pawed the ground, searching for another target. Sarah Miles felt her world collapse in that single, horrifying moment. The scream that tore from her throat was primal, animalistic. The sound a mother makes when watching her child disappear beneath ice. She was running before she even realized it, her nursing instincts warring with her wife's terror, as she fought against the arena workers trying to hold her back. "That's my husband," she shrieked, clawing at the fence like a caged animal. "Let me go. I'm a nurse. Let me help him." But Dr. Martinez was already there, his weathered hands moving across Jacob's skull with the practiced precision of someone who'd seen too many rodeo accidents. The veteran physician's face went pale as his fingers found the depression in Jacob's cranium, the bone giving way like an eggshell under pressure. Elena Miles watched her son dying in the dirt 20 feet away, and the world became a blur of sound and motion that made no sense. The rosary beads her late husband Tom had given her 30 years ago bit into her palms as she gripped them, praying in Spanish to a God who seemed to have forgotten her family existed. First Tom's broken back that ended his career, then his heart attack 5 years later, and now this. How much could one family endure? The paramedics worked with desperate efficiency, sliding Jacob onto a backboard as blood soaked through their gloves. His eyes were open but vacant, staring at the New Mexico sky without seeing the stars that had begun to emerge in the deepening twilight. The ventilation bag rhythmically forced air into his lungs, each squeeze a mechanical reminder that life was hanging by the thinnest of threads. "We're losing him," one of the paramedics muttered to his partner, but his words carried further than intended in the arena's shocked silence. "Blood pressure's dropping fast. We need to move now." The ambulance ride to Memorial Medical Center took 8 minutes, the same amount of time Jacob had needed to conquer Midnight Thunder. But those 8 minutes felt like 8 hours to Sarah, who held Jacob's blood-covered hand while paramedic Jenny Rodriguez worked to keep him alive. The siren wailed through Las Cruces like a banshee, warning traffic to clear the way for a young man whose dreams were leaking out through a crack in his skull. "Come on, Jacob," Sarah whispered, her tears falling onto his still fingers. "You've never backed down from a fight. Don't you dare start now." Dr. Rebecca Thompson was waiting in the emergency bay when they arrived, her surgical scrubs already in place. She'd been watching the rodeo on television with her husband when the accident happened, and she'd immediately called the hospital to prepare the operating room. At 45, Dr. Thompson had seen enough traumatic brain injuries to know that the first hour was critical. The difference between recovery and permanent disability, between life and death. The CT scan revealed what she'd feared. Jacob's brain was swelling rapidly inside his skull, the pressure building with each passing minute like water behind a dam. There was no time for lengthy explanations or second opinions. They needed to operate immediately, drilling holes in Jacob's skull to relieve the pressure before it crushed the delicate tissue that held his memories, his personality, his very essence. "We're taking him to surgery now," Dr. Thompson told Sarah and Elena as they rushed down the hospital corridor. "I won't lie to you, it's bad. Very bad. But he's young and strong, and that gives him a fighting chance." Sarah wanted to collapse right there in the hallway, wanted to curl up in a ball and wake up from this nightmare. But her nursing training kicked in, the clinical part of her mind that had guided her through countless emergencies. She knew the statistics for traumatic brain injuries. She knew that even if Jacob survived, he might never be the same man she'd married. The waiting room at Memorial Medical Center became a shrine to Jacob Miles that night. Danny Ramirez paced the worn linoleum like a caged wolf, still wearing his rodeo clothes, his champion buckle a bitter reminder of what should have been a celebration. Other riders filtered in throughout the night. Men with names like Dusty and Bull and Tornado, weathered faces marked by years of 8-second battles with 1,500-pound opponents. Maria Santos, the owner of the local Mexican restaurant where Jacob and Sarah often ate dinner, arrived with enough food to feed a small army. She'd known Jacob since he was a teenager, had watched him grow from a reckless kid into a responsible man. Now she sat with Elena, both women clutching their rosaries and whispering prayers in Spanish. The hours crawled by like wounded animals. Dr. Thompson emerged from surgery at 3 a.m, her face grim beneath the surgical mask she'd forgotten to remove. The small crowd in the waiting room held its collective breath as she approached Sarah and Elena. "The surgery went as well as could be expected," she said carefully. "We were able to relieve the pressure on his brain, and we've repaired the skull fracture. But there was significant trauma to the brain tissue, particularly in the areas that control motor function and speech." Sarah's legs gave out, and Danny caught her before she could hit the floor. The words she dreaded hearing as a nurse were even worse when applied to the man she loved. Motor function. Speech. The building blocks of everything that made Jacob who he was. "What does that mean?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Thompson sat down beside them, her professional composure cracking slightly. "It means we wait. We've induced a medical coma to give his brain time to heal. Sometimes people wake up from injuries like this completely normal. Sometimes they don't wake up at all. And sometimes they wake up different." The word hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Different. It was a clinical term for a reality too terrible to fully comprehend. The Jacob they knew. The man who could gentle wild horses with his voice, who remembered every conversation they'd ever had, who could make Sarah laugh even on her worst days, might be gone forever. As dawn broke over the Organ Mountains, painting the desert sky in shades of pink and gold, Jacob Miles lay connected to machines in the ICU, his body fighting a war for his very soul. The rodeo world held its breath, waiting to see if one of their own would emerge from the darkness. But in the sterile silence of room 314, the only sounds were the mechanical whispers of life support and the quiet sobs of two women who loved him. The accident at the southern New Mexico State Fair had lasted less than 30 seconds from dismount to impact. But its consequences would ripple through the rodeo community for decades to come, raising questions about safety, about the price of 8 seconds of glory, and about whether any championship was worth the risk of losing everything. The calendar on the wall of room 314 mocked Sarah Miles with its relentless progression. October became November. November bled into December, and still Jacob lay motionless in the mechanical embrace of life support. 67 days of watching monitors, counting respirator cycles, and praying to a God who seemed to have developed selective hearing. Sarah had taken leave from her nursing position at the hospital, though she never really left the building. She'd made the ICU waiting room her second home, sleeping in the same uncomfortable reclining chair night after night. Her supervisor, Linda Martinez, brought her meals and fresh clothes, but Sarah had lost 20 pounds anyway, her wedding ring sliding loose on her finger like a promise that might not hold. The medical team had tried to prepare her for this possibility, that Jacob might remain in the coma indefinitely. But hope was a stubborn thing, especially when it was all you had left. Every morning, Sarah would enter Jacob's room expecting to find him awake, maybe confused, maybe different, but present. Every evening, she left disappointed but determined to try again tomorrow. Dr. Thompson made her rounds at 8 a.m. sharp, checking Jacob's responses to stimuli, reviewing the endless stream of test results, and delivering updates that were always some variation of no change. But on December 15th, something was different in her expression when she pulled Sarah aside in the hallway. "We need to talk about long-term care options," Dr. Thompson said gently. "Jacob's condition has stabilized, but there's no indication of improvement. The swelling has gone down completely, and his brain activity is normal for someone in his condition. But he's not responding to any external stimuli." Sarah felt the words hit her like physical blows. Long-term care. The clinical euphemism for giving up, for admitting that Jacob might never come back to her. She'd seen it happen to other families during her years as a nurse. The gradual transition from hope to acceptance to the terrible logistics of warehousing a person who was no longer really there. "What are you saying exactly?" Sarah asked, though she knew the answer. "I'm saying that after this length of time, the likelihood of meaningful recovery becomes very small. We need to start considering facilities that specialize in long-term coma care. Places where Jacob would be comfortable and well-monitored, but where the focus shifts from recovery to maintenance." The word maintenance hit Sarah like a slap. Maintenance. Like Jacob was a piece of equipment that needed regular servicing, not the man who'd promised to love her until death did them part. Death would have been cleaner, she thought with immediate guilt. Death would have given her something to grieve, a funeral to plan, a grave to visit. This limbo was worse than mourning. It was hoping without hope. Elena had aged a decade in the past 2 months. The woman who'd raised Jacob single-handedly after his father's death now spent 12 hours a day reading to her unconscious son from the same Western novels Tom had loved. Her voice had grown hoarse from the constant talking, but she refused to stop. Someone had told her that familiar voices could sometimes reach coma patients, and she clung to that possibility like a lifeline. "Today we're going to finish Lonesome Dove," Elena would announce each morning, settling into the chair beside Jacob's bed with the worn paperback. "You always said it was your favorite, Mijo. Remember when you were 15 and you read the whole thing in 2 days? You said you wanted to be like Augustus McCrae, brave and funny and loyal to his friends." Danny Ramirez had kept writing, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. He'd won 3 more competitions since Jacob's accident, but the victories felt hollow. The rodeo community was small enough that everyone knew what had happened to Jacob Miles, and the specter of his accident hung over every arena like a storm cloud. Some riders quit after seeing what happened to Jacob. Others rode with a recklessness born of the knowledge that tomorrow was never guaranteed. The insurance companies were circling like vultures, trying to determine liability and minimize payouts. Jacob's medical bills had already exceeded $250,000, and they showed no signs of slowing down. Sarah had met with lawyers who spoke in terms of settlements and structured payments, reducing Jacob's suffering to columns of numbers and actuarial tables. Christmas came and went in room 314 without celebration. Sarah hung a small wreath on Jacob's bed, more out of habit than hope, and Elena brought tamales that grew cold on the nightstand. The nursing staff tried to maintain some holiday cheer, but it felt forced in the ICU, where every day was a battle between life and death with no regard for the calendar. On New Year's Eve, Sarah sat alone with Jacob while fireworks exploded over Las Cruces in the distance. She could hear them faintly through the hospital windows, celebrating the arrival of a year that Jacob might never know existed. She held his hand, noting how much weight he'd lost despite the feeding tube, how his calluses had softened from months without rope and leather. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," she whispered to him, her voice barely audible above the ventilator's mechanical breathing. "Everyone says I should move on, start thinking about my future. But how do I have a future without you?" His hand remained limp in hers, offering no comfort, no guidance, no sign that he'd heard her confession. The monitors continued their electronic vigil, tracking a life that existed somewhere between presence and absence, hope and despair. Dr. Thompson had given Sarah a deadline, February 1st. If Jacob showed no signs of improvement by then, she recommended transferring him to a long-term care facility in Albuquerque that specialized in persistent vegetative states. The clinical term was like a knife in Sarah's heart, but she understood the reality. Memorial Medical Center couldn't keep Jacob in the ICU indefinitely, and the costs were becoming astronomical. January crawled by with agonizing slowness. Sarah had started bringing photo albums to Jacob's room, flipping through pictures of their wedding, their honeymoon in Colorado, Jacob's victories in various rodeo arenas across the Southwest. She would describe each photo in detail, hoping that somewhere in the darkness of his damaged brain, Jacob might remember who he used to be. "This is from the Mesilla Valley Rodeo 2 years ago," she would say, holding up a photograph of Jacob grinning beside his trophy buckle. "You rode a bull named Earthquake and scored 87 points. You were so proud and I was so scared. I made you promise to be careful, and you laughed and said bulls were safer than driving to work." The irony was bitter now. Jacob had driven to and from work at the ranch supply store for years without incident. It was 8 seconds on a bull named Midnight Thunder that had stolen him away from her. By the end of January, Sarah had begun the terrible process of accepting reality. She toured the long-term care facility in Albuquerque, met with social workers, and filled out forms that reduced Jacob's vibrant life to checkbox categories of need and dependency. The facility was clean and professional, but it smelled like disinfectant and surrender. January 31st arrived like an execution date. Sarah spent the night in Jacob's room, holding vigil for what might be their last night together in the place where they'd fought so hard for his life. She'd made peace with the decision, or told herself she had. Jacob deserved better than a hospital room limbo, and she deserved the chance to rebuild her shattered life. As dawn broke over the desert on February 1st, Sarah prepared to say goodbye to the Jacob she'd married and hello to whatever remained. But sometimes, when you've given up all hope, when you've accepted the unacceptable and made peace with loss, life reminds you that miracles don't follow schedules or respect medical opinions. At 7:23 a.m., as Sarah was gathering her photos and preparing to meet with the transport team, Jacob Miles squeezed her hand. The squeeze was so faint that Sarah almost missed it, just the slightest pressure against her palm as she sat beside Jacob's bed on what was supposed to be their last morning together. For a moment, she thought her exhausted mind was playing tricks on her, manufacturing hope where none existed. But then it happened again, a definite, unmistakable squeeze that sent electricity shooting through her entire body. "Jacob," she whispered, her voice cracking with 2 months of suppressed hope. "Can you hear me?" Dr. Thompson was in surgery when the nurse paged her, but she broke scrub protocol and rushed to room 314 still wearing her surgical gown. What she found there defied everything her medical training had taught her about traumatic brain injuries and extended comas. Jacob's eyes were open, not the blank, staring gaze she'd grown accustomed to, but actual awareness flickering behind his brown irises like candlelight in a dark room. "Jacob, can you tell me your name?" Dr. Thompson asked, shining her penlight into his eyes to check his pupil response. Jacob's mouth moved, but no sound came out. The ventilator tube was still down his throat, forcing air into his lungs with mechanical precision. Dr. Thompson made a quick decision. If Jacob was truly conscious, the breathing tube would be causing him tremendous distress. She called for the respiratory team to remove it immediately. The next 20 minutes were controlled chaos as medical staff worked to transition Jacob from mechanical ventilation to breathing on his own. Sarah stood pressed against the wall, afraid to hope, afraid to breathe, afraid that any movement might somehow reverse this miracle and send Jacob back into the darkness. When they finally removed the tube, Jacob's first word was barely a whisper. "Sarah?" She was beside him in an instant, tears streaming down her face as she took his hand in both of hers. "I'm here, baby. I'm right here. You're going to be okay." But even as the words left her mouth, Sarah could see that Jacob wasn't okay. Might never be okay in the way they'd once understood the term. His speech was slurred, his movements uncoordinated. When he tried to lift his right arm, nothing happened. The left side of his body seemed to work normally, but the entire right side remained stubbornly still. Elena arrived within an hour, having driven from hatchet speeds that would have horrified her son if he'd been in any condition to worry. She burst into the ICU like a force of nature, speaking rapid Spanish prayers of gratitude as she kissed Jacob's forehead and stroked his hair. "Mijo, we thought we lost you," she said, switching to English when she noticed his confused expression. "You've been sleeping for over 2 months. It's February now." Jacob's brow furrowed as he processed this information. February. He remembered October, remembered the rodeo, remembered midnight thunder. But everything after that was a blank void, as if someone had torn pages out of the book of his life. Dr. Thompson ran a series of tests over the next few days, documenting the extent of Jacob's deficits with clinical precision. The damage to his brain had affected his motor cortex, leaving him with significant weakness on his right side. His speech was impaired, though his comprehension seemed largely intact. Most concerning to Sarah, who knew Jacob better than anyone, were the subtle changes in his personality, a flatness in his affect, a lack of the quick wit and easy humor that had defined him. "The brain is remarkably plastic," Dr. Thompson explained to Sarah and Elena during a family meeting. "With intensive therapy, Jacob may regain much of what he's lost. But I need you to understand that recovery from this type of injury is measured in years, not months. And there are no guarantees." Physical therapy began immediately. Jacob's therapist, Maria Gonzalez, was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd worked with stroke patients and brain injury survivors for over 20 years. She'd seen miracles and disasters in equal measure, and she approached Jacob's case with professional optimism tempered by realistic expectations. The first time Jacob tried to stand, he collapsed immediately, his right leg buckling beneath him like a broken branch. The frustration in his eyes was heartbreaking. This man who'd made his living on the backs of wild animals couldn't support his own weight for more than a few seconds. Sarah watched him struggle with simple tasks that had once been automatic, buttoning his shirt, holding a fork, writing his own name. Speech therapy was equally challenging. Jacob knew what he wanted to say, but the words came out jumbled and indistinct, like a radio signal fighting through static. Dr. Patricia Reeves, the speech pathologist, worked with him daily on exercises designed to retrain his brain to coordinate the complex muscle movements required for clear speech. Bull riding, Jacob managed during one session, his face flushed with effort. "Yes, you were a bull rider," Dr. Reeves confirmed. "Can you tell me more about that?" Jacob's eyes grew distant, searching for memories that seemed to flicker just beyond his reach. "Scared," he said finally. "Sarah scared." It was one of his first complete thoughts, and it broke Sarah's heart. Even in his diminished state, Jacob remembered her fear, understood on some level what his chosen profession had cost them both. The insurance battles resumed with renewed intensity once Jacob was conscious. The companies that had been content to let him linger in a coma were suddenly very interested in limiting their exposure now that he might actually recover. Sarah found herself navigating a maze of paperwork, fighting for coverage of rehabilitation services that Jacob desperately needed. Danny visited regularly, bringing news from the rodeo circuit, and trying to maintain some connection to the world Jacob had lost. But the conversations were stilted and painful. Jacob couldn't follow complex stories, couldn't remember riders they'd competed against for years. The easy camaraderie that had defined their friendship was replaced by an uncomfortable awareness of everything that had changed. "You remember Midnight Thunder?" Jacob asked during one visit, the words coming slowly and carefully. Danny nodded. "Yeah, buddy. I remember. Did I make 8? The question hung in the air like smoke. Jacob had made his 8 seconds, had conquered the bull that ultimately conquered him. But the victory seemed hollow now, a Pyrrhic triumph that had cost him nearly everything. "Yeah, Jake. You made 8. Jacob smiled then, the first genuine smile Sarah had seen since his awakening. For that moment, the old Jacob flickered back to life. The competitor who'd measured success in 8-second increments, who'd risked everything for the chance to prove himself against impossible odds. As winter gave way to spring, Jacob's progress was maddeningly slow but undeniable. He graduated from a wheelchair to a walker, from single words to halting sentences, from complete dependence to small victories of independence. Each milestone was celebrated like a major holiday. The first time he fed himself, the first time he walked to the bathroom unassisted, the first time he laughed at something on television. But with progress came awareness, and awareness brought its own kind of suffering. Jacob began to understand the magnitude of what he'd lost, not just his physical abilities, but his identity as a bull rider, his dreams of ranch ownership, his role as the strong provider in his marriage to Sarah. Depression settled over him like a thick fog, making even simple therapy exercises feel insurmountable. "I'm not the same man," he told Sarah one evening as they sat in the rehabilitation center's garden. "You didn't marry this." Sarah took his good hand in both of hers, feeling the calluses that were slowly fading from months of inactivity. "You're still Jacob. You're still the man who courted me for 6 months before I'd agree to go out with you. You're still the man who cried when we got married. You're still the man who always puts extra hot sauce on his eggs and falls asleep watching Western movies." But even as she said the words, Sarah knew they weren't entirely true. The Jacob she'd married was gone, replaced by this new person who looked like her husband but spoke differently, moved differently, thought differently. It wasn't his fault, and it wasn't her fault, but it was their reality. The question that haunted their nights and filled their silences was simple and terrible. Was love enough to bridge the gap between who Jacob had been and who he was becoming? And if it wasn't, what then? 6 months after Jacob squeezed Sarah's hand for the first time, he stood at the edge of the arena at the Ana County Rodeo, gripping his walker with white knuckles and watching young men risk their lives for 8 seconds of glory. The familiar sounds washed over him. The crowd's anticipation, the announcer's patter, the snorts and bellows of bulls in the chutes. But instead of stirring his blood with excitement, they filled him with a complex mixture of longing and dread. Sarah stood beside him, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder. She'd been reluctant to bring him to this rodeo, worried that watching other riders would only remind Jacob of everything he'd lost. But Dr. Reeves had suggested that confronting his past might be an important step in processing his trauma and moving forward. "That's Tommy Valdez," Jacob said slowly, pointing to a young rider adjusting his gear in the chutes. His speech had improved dramatically over the months of therapy, though he still spoke more deliberately than before, choosing each word with care. "He's from Roswell. Good rider, but he drops his left shoulder." It was the most Jacob had spoken about rodeo since his accident, and Sarah was surprised by the clarity of his observation. The brain injury had taken so much from him, but his understanding of bull riding technique remained sharp, like a skill too deeply ingrained to be erased entirely. The young rider, Tommy Valdez, was indeed favoring his left side as he positioned himself on the bull's back. Jacob watched with the eye of someone who'd made the same mistake countless times before learning to correct it. The bull in the chute was a smaller animal than Midnight Thunder, but Jacob could see the coiled violence in its posture, the way its muscles bunched and shifted as it prepared for battle. "He's going to get thrown to the left," Jacob predicted, his voice gaining strength as he analyzed the situation. "That bull, Dusty Devil, He always spins right out of the chute. When the gate opened, Tommy Valdez lasted exactly 4.5 seconds before Dusty Devil deposited him in the dirt with a bone-jarring thud. The young man got up quickly, brushing dust off his jeans and forcing a grin for the crowd, but Jacob could see the disappointment in his posture. 4.5 seconds was a long way from 8. "I could help him," Jacob said quietly, the words surprising them both. Sarah looked at her husband with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Help him how?" Jacob was quiet for a long moment, his damaged brain working through possibilities that had never occurred to him before his accident. He'd always thought of himself as a rider, never considering what would happen when riding was no longer possible. But standing there watching Tommy Valdez make preventable mistakes, Jacob realized that his years of experience hadn't disappeared with his ability to sit on a bull's back. "I could teach. Show him what he's doing wrong." The idea took root slowly over the following weeks. Jacob began attending more rodeos, not as a competitor but as an observer, taking notes in his painstaking new handwriting and studying video footage with the intensity he'd once reserved for his own rides. Sarah watched this transformation with cautious optimism. It was the first time since his awakening that Jacob had shown genuine enthusiasm for anything. Danny Ramirez was initially skeptical when Jacob approached him about coaching. "Jake, you know I love you like a brother, but do you really think you're ready for this? It's only been 6 months since you woke up." But Jacob's analysis of Danny's recent rides was so insightful, so precisely targeted, that Danny found himself listening despite his reservations. Jacob had always been a student of the sport, but his forced separation from competition had given him a new perspective. He could see patterns and problems that active riders missed because they were too close to the action. "You're rushing your setup," Jacob told Danny as they watched video of a recent ride. "You're so eager to nod, to signal the gate, that you're not taking time to get properly seated. Look here." He paused the video, pointing with his good hand to Danny's position on the bull's back. "Your weight is already shifting forward before the gate opens." Danny studied the frozen image and realized Jacob was right. The observation led to a breakthrough in Danny's riding. His scores improved dramatically once he learned to take an extra moment in the chute to ensure proper positioning. Word spread through the tight-knit rodeo community that Jacob Miles had insights worth hearing. Young riders began seeking him out, asking for advice on technique, mental preparation, and bull selection. Jacob found himself developing a new identity. Not the broken-down former champion some had expected, but a teacher whose understanding of the sport had been deepened rather than diminished by his ordeal. But Jacob's growing involvement with rodeo brought him face to face with uncomfortable truths about the sport he'd once loved without question. Working with young riders, he saw the same reckless abandon he'd once possessed, the same willingness to sacrifice long-term health for short-term glory. He watched 18-year-olds take hits that made him wince, knowing from personal experience where such impacts could lead. The breaking point came at a high school rodeo in Silver City, when Jacob watched a 16-year-old named Mark Henderson take a devastating fall that left him unconscious in the dirt. The boy was rushed to the hospital with a concussion, and Jacob found himself in the familiar waiting room, surrounded by worried family members and the antiseptic smell of fear. "This has to stop," Jacob told Sarah on the drive home. "These kids, they don't understand what they're risking." "I didn't understand, not really, until it happened to me." That night, Jacob began writing, slowly, laboriously, using his left hand to compensate for the right side that still refused to fully cooperate. He wrote about the culture of invincibility that permeated rodeo, about the pressure young riders felt to prove their courage by taking unnecessary risks, about the inadequate safety measures that left competitors vulnerable to life-changing injuries. His first article, 8 Seconds, The Hidden Cost of Courage, was published in the Western Horseman magazine 3 months later. It was a brutally honest account of his accident and its aftermath, written with the authority of someone who'd paid the ultimate price for rodeo glory. The response was immediate and polarizing. Some praised Jacob for his honesty, while others accused him of trying to destroy the sport he claimed to love. But Jacob's message resonated with parents and young riders who'd never considered the long-term consequences of rodeo competition. He began speaking at high school assemblies and youth rodeo events, sharing his story not to discourage participation, but to promote safer practices and realistic risk assessment. His advocacy caught the attention of the Professional Rodeo Cowboys Association, which invited Jacob to join a newly formed safety committee. It was the first time the organization had included an injured rider in such discussions, acknowledging that those who'd paid the price for inadequate safety measures might have valuable insights to offer. Jacob threw himself into the work with the same intensity he'd once brought to bull riding. He researched helmet designs, studied impact data, and worked with equipment manufacturers to develop better protective gear. The irony wasn't lost on him. His greatest contribution to rodeo would come not from his success as a rider, but from his spectacular failure. The changes came slowly, fought every step of the way by traditionalists who viewed safety equipment as a sign of weakness. But Jacob's growing influence and the support of forward-thinking riders began to shift the culture. Helmet use among younger competitors increased dramatically, protective vests became more common, and emergency medical protocols were upgraded at rodeo venues across the Southwest. Sarah watched these developments with pride tinged by sadness. This new Jacob was admirable in ways the old one had never been. More thoughtful, more compassionate, more aware of consequences beyond his own immediate desires. But she sometimes missed the reckless confidence that had first attracted her to him, the easy laughter that had filled their early years together. Their marriage had survived Jacob's injury, but it had been transformed in the process. They were more tender with each other now, more conscious of how quickly everything could change. But they were also more distant in some ways, as if the trauma had built a wall between who they'd been and who they were becoming. On the second anniversary of his accident, Jacob returned to the southern New Mexico State Fair. He stood in the same arena where Midnight Thunder had changed his life, but this time he wasn't alone. A group of young riders surrounded him, listening intently as he explained proper dismount techniques and the importance of protective equipment.